Welcome everyone to today's webinar titled AI Agents and Cash Forecasting, Solving the Accuracy and Agility Challenge. This is Brian from Strategic Treasurer, and we're pleased you could join us as we consider how AI agents can aid in improving agility and accuracy in cash forecasting. Our speakers for today are Alexander Kempf, Strategic FinTech Leader at TIS, and Craig Jeffery, Founder and Managing Partner of Strategic Treasurer. Welcome, Alex and Craig, and I'll now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you everyone for joining in your afternoon, morning, or evening. We really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to spend it with us on this interesting topic. And Alex, this is our first webinar together, so good to do it with you.
It is. Glad to be here and very excited to talk about this topic with you guys.
We've had fun prepping for it, so looking forward to it. And this topic about AI agents, agentic AI, using artificial intelligence, the do part, the agents that do things. And as we hone in on this topic of cash forecasting, solving the accuracy and agility challenge, getting things right and being able to be nimble is so important for many, many organizations. So this is a key area for almost everyone in Treasury. So thank you for joining us on this topic. But let me get into the list. Here's our agenda. We'll start with AI distinction. So we'll look at just a couple of the common terms: machine learning, the ability to detect patterns. We'll look at generative AI briefly and define that as the ability to create, and then agentic is doing. From there, we'll move to AI use and relevance. And so we'll look at use cases that make sense in finance, that make sense in Treasury in particular. Then we'll move over to cash forecasting, which is probably where the greatest level of interest is on today's webinar. We'll camp there for a while. We'll look at how organizations are tasked with running more models, having more forecasts, more accuracy, more expectations, and the need for more help and assistance is certainly there in the area of forecasting. And that's where AI helps with accuracy and agility, ability to respond to these additional requests. Then for engaging AI, this subtitle is Leveraging AI in Cash Forecasting. We'll continue the conceptual walkthrough of how to think about forecasting, how to make your forecast better, and using artificial intelligence to do that. Then on the AI agents side, we'll spend a little bit of time looking at what are individual AI agents and how can you get individual agents to work together, this idea of collaboration or orchestration. So using an agent to control other agents. Orchestration is probably the most common term. You may think of it as a macro that calls other macros, or one agent to rule them all. However you like to think of it, that's a way to go on that. And the key takeaways, we'll finish up. We'll look at what to target and prioritize. Second, we'll look at really achieving what we need to do. How can we prioritize that? We'll look at governance, and then finally, we'll look at a strategic perspective on readying your organization for the future. I won't necessarily say future-proofing, but future-ready your organization. So those are our areas that we're covering today. We appreciate you spending some time with us. And so we'll split this between Alex and me. We'll cover these. Alex, why don't you start us off on machine learning, generative AI, and I'll wrap up with agentic AI.
Absolutely. Thanks, Craig. And yeah, this is a topic dear to my heart, not just at TIS, but just in general. We hear so much about AI all of the time now. Everybody kind of wants to jump onto it. But really, there's kind of one problem, which is that so many people have different understandings of what AI actually means. And there's so many different buzzwords within it too, right? We hear AI a lot, mostly lately due to the revolutionary large language model advances in the past 2 years. But if we want a productive conversation around it, we need to make sure that we also know the differences, right? As a short analogy, machine learning could be, for example, your weather forecast, right? Generative AI could be the meteorologist that writes up the report. And then agentic AI could be your assistant that reschedules your outdoor event accordingly. So you don't just suddenly replace machine learning with agentic AI or something like that. They all play together and they all kind of play their own role. when it comes to all of these different buzzwords that we have nowadays, there's machine learning, which can be supervised, unsupervised, whatever, evolutionary, deep learning, natural language processing, generative AI, agents, and so on. I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but at its core, machine learning is really an umbrella term for various types of algorithms, right? From simple regressions or clustering to full-on deep learning, which is probably where the overlap with AI, as many people today understand it, begins. The common factor here is machine learning is really mostly about prediction. You have some set of historical data, and you want to recognize patterns within that and then predict what the future might look like. Typical use cases in treasury for that could be predicting your liquidity needs in a cash flow forecasting model, or also fraud prevention via anomaly detection, on the payment side of things. So the value here is really better accuracy on repeatable questions. Generative AI, on the other hand, like the name implies, is about creating, whether it's text, code, music. The outputs are essentially new content, and it's a special subset of machine learning algorithms. It's important to understand that it's not some kind of magic, right? It relies on the exact same statistical concept as machine learning does, but typically on a somewhat larger scale with different techniques. And the use cases really reach far and wide. But for example, could be assembling your cash position, explaining your FX exposures in simple language. It's really all about speed and a clarity play as well. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how scientifically accurate your definition of AI is. It's just that everybody within your organization that is involved in some kind of AI transformation project should have the same understanding of it, right? When you mention AI, agents, other terms, what it is that it actually needs to be achieved. The cool thing is what happens when you put everything together, of course, and that's where agentic AI really comes to shine. And Craig is going to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So the machine learning, predicting, generative AI, creating using large language models and other techniques, and then agentic AI is the action, the doing. So this is by itself, an agent can run a task or pursue goals in one system, or you can set up agents running against multiple systems, maybe to take data out, manipulate it, check it, load it into another system or process. And so when we think of agentic AI or agents, think of macros or macros that run across systems. A fairly common term recently is robotic process automation. So this is similar to that in that it can act and engage with different and various systems and coordinate that activity. But instead of just robotic, I'll say thoughtless activity, agentic AI has the ability to adapt, respond, and to bring humans in when you need them. And so it's a much more intelligent or responsive way and adaptive way of using that activity. So on the agentic side, a couple examples. Cash forecasting is a big one because cash forecasting is the top area that organizations would work on. Of all the things that they could do, they would spend more time on it. They would run more models. It's become more important to their management. And so this is a key area. And so the ability to run a cash forecast is usually comprised of a number of steps and activities. Gathering data. Well, agentic AI can go and grab the data, can cleanse it or check it against standards and other elements so that it can tell you if this is unreasonable, this is outside the band, look at it. And so it can interact with different systems to pull data if there's not necessarily a regular feed that's more manual. You can automate those through these agents. Another example that we have on the screen is, FX hedge adjustments. You may hedge. You're trying to keep your exposures within a certain band, keep your hedges within a range. And as your exposures change over time, as you get closer, you can set up your agents to check and see that, are we still within that range? If we're outside that range, what is the recommendation to put another hedge on to do this particular activity? And so it can help the organization and help your risk people in this case to be prepared to make whatever steps are necessary. We covered three things, three big terms. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add there, Alex, before we move on.
No, I think that's great. I think the one point that I really want to make is that for agentic AI, your organization really needs to be ready for it, right? This is where you pull in all of these different factors that Craig mentioned. And so it's not just a one-step process. It's not about just saying, hey, let me just very quickly implement agentic AI. It's a little bit more involved in that, but you don't have to start there, right? You can start with the generative AI and then slowly pull together multiple factors, multiple systems to really put together your agents in a cohesive way.
Yeah, excellent. So great information to start us off with, and that brings us to our first jumbo poll question. We have 3, 6, 7 options, and this is select all that apply. It's multiple choice. So the question is, please indicate your familiarity and use of agentic AI. So read each question and check every one that applies. And when you're done, hit the submit button, and that will be how you push those answers into the core system. I'll give everybody just a moment, and I'll give you some additional instructions. So as you go ahead and finish submitting those, if you're done, or if you can't find it, there's some comments in the chat box. Brian has indicated how you might be able to find the polls and quizzes if you don't see it. Alt tab, or find out it's behind your 7th image on the 4th screen on your desk. You might be able to locate it that way. Also, I'll mention in the chat box, there's follow TIS on LinkedIn. Please select that, follow them to get good information on what's going on. Other topics, it's an easy way to stay connected on social media. So too with Strategic Treasury on LinkedIn. There's a link there. Just go ahead and feel free to click those and follow. And it's great. It's great for our marketing teams. It's fun for us and good for you. So Alex, I'll let you comment on this. I'll just say a couple of things. Number one, for sure, is this 5/9 of people know what agentic AI is. So that's excellent. If we went back 3 months, I would venture to guess that number would be under 20%. That's my guess. 4% are using it, testing it about double, using it at work about double that, so at 8 and 7%. And broader company use is 14%. And I guess about 1 in 7 have experimented with agentic AI here in this group. Any thoughts on this? Is this kind of the average in Treasury? Is this any thoughts on this?
Yeah, Craig, I mean, I love this poll because it reflects exactly what we're seeing, right? There's so many people that are getting more and more aware of what agentic AI is, and that's just great to see because there are so many use cases for it. But then there is this discrepancy where, 55% of people are aware of it, but way less have actually been using it or using it successfully. Although it's still cool to see that there's 14% that are currently testing it, which is about what we see as well in our client base. And the goal is just to increase that as much as possible. Of course, only where it makes sense, because there are some parts, and I'm kind of teasing on what we're going to talk about later, but there are parts where it doesn't necessarily make sense to use agentic AI as well.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for answering that first poll question. If we have 100 people type in TIS in the chat box, we'll send you the results of all the poll questions with the deck. So yeah, just type TIS and get 100. I won't pester you anymore. I picked a nice low number just for fun. All right, so let's go to a recent survey about what's going on. How does this compare to our audience, everybody that we just took the survey from the group of people that are attending? Experimented was a little bit higher, 32%. Have experimented using agentic AI in one or more areas, 22%. I think that was close. And then we're using agentic AI within my department, 18%. So that was higher. So those that responded to the AI and Treasury survey found a little bit more participation percentage-wise than on our particular audience today. And that's all good, and it's useful to know. So experimenting with agentic AI, I think almost everybody's experimented with generative AI, asking ChatGPT to create a report or some kind of output, or using one of the ones to create images. And then agentic AI is clearly less used. We use 3 tools at work, Alex, for For AI, we use ChatGPT, subscription version. We use Taskade, and we also use Copilot. So we have different use cases and examples where we're using that to perform functions. We're actually doing a lot of testing and gaining experience in these areas of agents and additional agents. So that's what we're doing in that area.
Yeah, I think it also goes back to my earlier point that there's a lot of blurring the lines, I suppose, where you could use Copilot as part of, an agentic AI pilot model, right? Where you just have multiple instances of Copilot doing different things, or you can also just use it very simply for a Q&A style of trying to just get some information out of your emails. So it really depends what you're doing with these different tools. But in general, we definitely see an uptick of how many people are using it, how many people want to use it, just again, because there's so much noise around it and so many great use cases too.
Yeah. All right. You mentioned large language models, and this is
Yep.
one of the more modern developments. I'd love for you to explain this in some more detail.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you are in this webinar, then, in all likelihood already, you have heard of large language models, right? In short, LLMs. These are your typical ChatGPTs, Claudes, Mistral, Gemini, etc. Basically, most of today's large tech companies kind of compete in this space by producing their own, and they each have their own, strengths and weaknesses. So you can kind of tweak your use case depending on which one you use. They dominate headlines for a very simple reason. It just allows for very, very natural conversational interactions with someone, in quotation marks, that has access to an entire library of information, basically the entire internet, so to speak, right? There have been some developments in there already where previously they were just based on historical data, and now LLMs can also kind of browse the internet and make sure to get more up-to-date data as well. When people mention AI solutions, most of the time, they're really talking about using LLMs in some form or another in particular. The ability to do things by using actual language is charming, right? So users don't need to become intricately familiar with a particular system's design anymore, or remember where every detail of a certain information is stored or what it is. You can just communicate your intent because that's what language is, right? Language is just about communicating intent, and therefore, indirectly, of course, LLMs understand your intent. There's only one way to push a button, but multiple ways to talk about doing it, so to speak, right? So for Treasury, this is super crucial because you all deal with so much data all day long and very sensitive data at that. So LLMs unlock the value in your underlying data, so to speak, right? If used correctly, you can suddenly pull conclusions from your data in seconds that usually you would have needed to spend a couple hours in Excel for, just adjusting pivot tables, etc. The LLM, in my opinion, should not be the brain, right? You stay in that seat. You are always the brain that coordinates everything, but it can be both your interface and also your data explorer. And those are kind of the key values that the LLM provides there. Now, you might have noticed something, which is that I keep mentioning that LLMs help with access to data. But in your organizations, I would very much imagine you didn't exactly publish your data to the internet for LLMs to be trained on, right? And the real value therefore shows up when the model that you use can reliably connect to the right data and the right tools as well. So for example, bank balances, accounts receivable aging, just in general, your data warehouse, right? Of course, that access needs certain guardrails around it, right? You don't suddenly want an AI going wild in your database and changing values left and right, etc. And this is where concepts such as MCP come in. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have heard of MCP, and if you have, please put it in the chat. But it stands for Model Context Protocol. And you can think of it as the equivalent of APIs, but in the world of AI, basically. So with MCP, what you can do is you can define which data and functions are accessible to your AI model. And those are typically divided into three key capability types. So you have resources, which are kind of read-only data, such as database query results. You have tools, which actually let you do things. So they call functions with user approval, of course, or for example, creating rules for your forecast or something like that. And then you have prompts that guide how the LLM behaves for a better user experience with this particular experience. integration. So basically, what it is it allows you to integrate all of your different systems. Suddenly, you can integrate, your banks, you can integrate your ERP, you can integrate your Salesforce, and you can make sure that the LLM has access to the right data and even has access to editing that data, but with very, very strict constraints. So essentially, your LLM suddenly becomes your, in quotation marks again, coworker, and it now has connective tissue, allowing it to actually interact with all of the rest of your IT landscape, which is the exact key that we need in order to actually unlock agentic workflows. So all of the different ones that Craig was talking about earlier, right? So these are really cool developments. And if you hear this word MCP, sometimes on a website or something, what you'll notice is that more and more startups, more and more businesses kind of offer their own because they want their products to be integrated within the AI tools that you use.
So a question or maybe a discussion, Alex, is large language models, we tend to think of the more good data you have in the large language model that trains your AI, the better the AI is going to be. MCP, do you think of that more as here's a border or a container around the data that it accesses, or is it governance around data, how it interacts, how it's to function? Yeah, how would you describe those two in interaction?
I would say more so than a border, it's actually the opposite because it opens up the world of possibility of interacting with data that previously you weren't able to interact with, right? So if I go to ChatGPT today and I ask it about, my cash forecast, it's not going to give me any answer on it because it just doesn't have access to that data. And I can't just pull it in there. I could, I guess, copy paste it in there, but then we'd be opening a whole world of compliance issues. Really what it is, it's on one hand, the guardrails, like you mentioned, right? Making sure that it is contained in what it can access, but also it's opening it up to a world of, okay, now I can access what I need to access, right? So suddenly your LLM that was this big library of knowledge becomes more like, a library with tons of open doors with employees going in and out and adding new books from all of those different other establishments that they frequented or something like that, right? So there are those different ways of viewing it. I've seen a question here whether corporates are okay with MCP usage from a data protection standpoint. Now, obviously, the answer to that is it depends, right? It really depends on which MCPs we're talking about, which language models we're talking about, and of course, what your internal rules are. Generally speaking, though, an MCP does not mean that you're giving away, your data to the public. It doesn't mean that you're going against your compliance rules. MCP is nothing more than a more technical layer on how to connect two systems that were previously disconnected, right? If it feeds into public LLMs, that's a different question, right? You can't obviously just add your data into a public LLM. That's what I meant earlier with just pasting your data somewhere. But what you do is you kind of connect your private instance of it that you pay for typically with those different connection mechanisms. So really, again, the parallel to draw here is it is your API. It is your API just on the AI side, right? Currently, what you might be doing is you might be connecting your Salesforce data to your ERP, or you might be connecting your ERP, for example, to your cash flow forecast. This will be happening via API because you're pulling different tables from your ERP into your forecast, right? And really what you want to do if you want to integrate it, or I guess interface it with natural language, you'll need a way to access that. And that is where MCP comes in. Does that make
Thank
sense, Craig?
Yeah, it does. I think that's helpful as we get into some of the more detailed terms. It's useful to know how things operate at a conceptual level without knowing all the details. And so that was a
For
great
sure.
great explanation. All right, we'll continue to move forward with the discussion on the cash flow forecasting goals, and then discuss how AI helps. If our two primary aspects, what are we shooting for? What are we hoping to accomplish? We want agility, the ability to respond rapidly to different changes, to different requirements, as well as accuracy. When we think about forecasting, those two tend to be top. Accuracy because of, its cash flows, it's how much you hedge or manage your exposures. So accuracy matters significantly. Agility, I think, always matters a lot. There are times when it matters an extremely high level, which we've seen recently. We saw it back in the first 6 months of COVID. We see it during financial crises. So sometimes it's extraordinarily important. Other times it's just very important, which in most of the cases that's what we see with forecasts. It's always in the red line side. So what's important with the goals? We need to respond to market shifts. There could be global economic items, tariffs, countries going into recession, all kinds of situations that could come up, trade wars, physical wars. All of these macroeconomic and geopolitical issues can create a shift which organizations need to adapt to, maybe operationally, but also financially. On the second point about supporting rapid decision making, you can get questions from the executive committee, from the CEO. What happens if this occurs or that occurs? And it may be just they're reading something from board meeting conversations, or they're looking and expecting something to occur. How do you make decisions on forecasting? This input's changed significantly. We're going to have a harder time acquiring these materials for our goods. All of those matters, and the ability to adapt to flexible situations, if you will, are quite helpful. I know everyone on this call is familiar with optimizing cash use, making good use of it, and the ability to do that on the fly more accurately over short periods and long-term periods makes sense. A couple other aspects on there is, how can you stay competitive as an organization? It's part of that's the overall business, how that runs normally, but there's a significant feedback loop in terms of efficiency of the financial process and the financial forecast. So when we look at the cash forecast, being more agile, having greater agility, allows us to model things more rapidly and more accurately. That translates to greater confidence, higher interest income, lower interest expense for borrowing. And so agility is crucial on that. I think everyone agrees with that, understands that. On the accuracy side, if you've ever been to an organization that's not doing as well financially, they tend to do very, very well in their forecasts. They are spending a lot of time to make sure it's right. Some organizations that are very cash rich can have a little bit more margin of error and tend not to focus on that. But accuracy helps with financing costs, your ability to manage risks properly, so you're not over hedging, under hedging, not experiencing exposures that you don't want to. And the other aspects about compliance and reporting, the forecasts, the different models feed into how an organization governs itself effectively. Everything from when you're talking with lenders to how the organization plans and prepares. So the better you do there, the more accurate your planning, your activities can be. So those are the two key things that almost every organization with cash forecasting goals has as top areas of focus.
Yeah, I'd actually say that those are the two main twin pillars, right, of forecasting in general, with agility keeping you nimble and ready to act, and accuracy just keeping you safe, and was ultimately what drives cost efficiency. And from what I've seen in the market, many people actually underestimate the value of that operational efficiency, right, of that agility, so to speak. So when we talk about AI, it could really come in at any point, right? And the key is to evaluate which one makes sense for your organization and why, which is what we'll cover later. But I just want to make the point that even in the agility piece, there's a lot of different things that AI can do for you.
So now, not every use case or example of implementing AI has come out rosy, or it's come out superb. And I think it's probably clear to say that both Alex and I are very positive about AI and what can be done, but that does not mean it just comes without warnings.
Exactly. And I'm sure some of you might have even seen it. There's this recent MIT study that came out where basically they kind of revealed this shocking number of 95% of AI pilots at companies that are failing. Now, how are they defining failing, right? Basically, they're just saying they are not driving any kind of organizational success that is measurable, which is a bit of a shame, right? Because you're putting so much effort into it, so much money too sometimes in order to drive these pilots, and then nothing comes out of it. Now, the headlines sound kind of bleak, but the reasons are really practical and really fixable too, with relatively minimal effort, I would say. It's really all about kind of being extremely intentional and on when and on where to deploy AI. And it's not really an issue with the concept of AI itself. It's kind of like, AI opens up this shiny new world that everybody wants a piece of. But the problem is that sometimes you're better off not having a piece of it, right? So multiple things here. Some of the reasons that I mentioned in this study that you see on the slide, and I'd say most of them are really self-explanatory, and I can corroborate many of these with what I've experienced as well. When something is as hyped as AI, many will rush to use it anywhere, like I just mentioned. But really, you need to make sure that you have actual clear business goals for it first, right? So numerically, you need to define clear success criteria, right? Clear KPIs. For example, your cycle time to refresh a forecast, accuracy error bands by entity or currency, or just straight up financial impact and avoided fees from better positioning and working capital that is being freed up. So I'd say as a recommendation, whenever you have a pilot, give each pilot a 90-day return on investment hypothesis and kind of threshold on when to continue and when to stop. And of course, the quite obvious core message from MIT here is that the value just fails when the goals aren't crisp. Data quality is another one, of course, and it's one of the biggest culprits, I'd say. On one hand, you have LLMs that are really, really good at organizing and pulling data from whatever you give them, right? PDFs, Excels, etc., etc. But I'm sure a lot of you have actually already experienced it that AIs can also hallucinate, right? They can just come up with data where there is none if you didn't give it to them, or they can look at it in the wrong column or something like that. So if you want to actually have a proper use case within your organization, you need to make sure that you very clearly understand what you're feeding it and why. The best way to do that is to start small, right? With maybe one golden source per metric and use MCPs that I mentioned earlier in a way that data is already somewhat cleaned before being returned, right? If you use different agents, all of them, of course, also should have the same input data to be able to view that same truth. So can you use AI to kind of clean up dirty data, so to speak? Absolutely. But if you want to really measure your use case and then the success of it, I think it's very important that you still take care of data quality as well. And this, of course, very clearly leads into the next point, which is whatever you do, don't boil the ocean here, right? Ship let's call it a walking skeleton first, right? One key functionality that you can expand on after measuring the uplift, right? Often solving the boring problems can drive far more value than, just jumping onto the shiniest new thing. And it's really tempting to throw AI, for example, at your go-to-market functions, right? To automate messaging. But I'm sure that as treasurers, you understand just how much uplift there could be in just solving some of those operational complexities first before going to any of these other things. Ownership and enablement, of course, is another topic that obviously just doesn't apply to AI, but really any organizational process. But if you add AI into the organization, but don't designate process owners and a few key power users across multiple business lines that will actually track the success for you, well, how can you evaluate it in the first place, right? So it makes it really, really difficult to say, hey, did this actually work? Is this worth it to invest more money and more time into, or is it not? I think the last 2 points here are really general points that are self-explanatory. But Craig, any experiences you've had that you'd like to add on here?
Yeah, I guess a couple things. I liked how you mentioned AI hallucinations, and there's an aspect of artificial intelligence when it's creating, it's interpolating or it's extrapolating, it's taking what it knows and trying to give you an answer from that. And so most things that it does, unless you're just asking it to repeat or summarize what's been there, some form of hallucination, either a good hallucination based off data, or it's going too far. And I think that's a helpful thing to keep in our minds when we come up with these business use cases. I I don't think I would like to see that number go down from 95% of AI pilots are failing. And a couple of the areas that I would like to see is I think it's fine to have some AI pilots that the definition of what you're trying to do may change over time. Like you're trying to accomplish something, and as you gain experience, it can change. It shouldn't be just like, let's just learn, but let's learn. And here's what we hope to learn. And through the process of learning, you learn better how to learn and how to set those goals. The other factor I imagine, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well, is the tools are improving so rapidly that what's a failure
Yeah.
today may be a moderate success next week, maybe a resounding success in 3 months. And so gaining familiarity with tools means we have a better opportunity for success. Now, it needs to be directed, needs to have oversight. If you layer out your list of here are the things that I would like to accomplish, here's why I think AI makes sense. Here's my pilot. I broke it down into small sections. We tend to do better. And I guess one example is one thing we were trying to do was pulling way too many steps into one process.
Mm.
And it just gives you junk and junk. And then when you start to break it out smaller, like summarize these things, and from those 10 things, build some more data from that and refine it and review it. When you chunk it down smaller, it's more powerful. And the learning is better. And so that's one of the things that we've learned as we iterated. Keep them small, keep your agents small, do a discrete function, get those working well, and then you can chain them together. Those are some of the things that I would say, Alex. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with that. Generally, when you have those smaller use cases, it makes it much easier to have that oversight that you mentioned, right? And again, I just want to iterate on the ownership piece, because it is so important to have someone who learns from these experiences and is able to actually then kind of repeat on those as well. This kind of also brings us to our next point here, which is, when is AI actually useful, right? I'm sure that this number of 95%, if you break it down, there's probably a bunch of use cases in there where you could have said from the beginning, hey, if I had spent like, half an hour evaluating it, maybe you would have seen that it wasn't the best use case for AI in the first place, right? So absolutely, I think as long as there's some good intent behind it on why we're pursuing an AI solution for a certain process step, that number should go down by a lot.
Excellent. Which makes me think it's time for a poll question. And our
Great.
next poll question is determining the success of AI. This is again, select all that apply. How does your organization determine whether an AI use case is useful or successful? There are 6 particular options. The last one is other or ensure. So if you don't select any of the first 5, go ahead and select other or ensure. We'll give everybody a chance to complete that. And we also need 25 more TISs in the chat. And then we'll share all the poll results in the deck on these pages when it's completed. So
The cool thing about AI is just because it's so new, there keep being new developments in the field, and everybody just has a different way of doing things, and none of them are necessarily wrong, right? It's just a different way of approaching it, and then you can kind of evaluate, hey, which one's better, right? And then everybody will jump kind of on that approach then next, which is really cool to see.
all right. So and Brian, I don't know if you want to pop in my connection on LinkedIn in the chat box, but I'd be happy to connect with anybody here. Just go ahead and send me a connection. Alex, if you'd like that too, just shoot a note to Brian, and he'll add that. You want to do a connection?
Gladly, gladly. Yeah, the results look super interesting. I mean, honestly, relatively even across the board, I'd say, right, Greg?
Yeah, we don't have currently evaluate AI use cases a quarter, other insurers. That's 60% of the,
Mm.
well, that's not necessarily 60 because it's select all that apply, but a quarter. We measure ROI or cost savings. Interesting. Slightly lower, still 23%. We measure forecast accuracy or operational improvements. I like that one a lot. We pilot and evaluate user feedback, still about a quarter. And then 1 out of 11 or 9% benchmark against industry peers. Will benchmarking against industry peers become more important over time, or is it more important at the early stages of AI?
I think it's going to gain in importance, but the issue is that it's very hard to do, right? It's a lot easier to kind of just look at the direct tangible ROI that you get from a project. Well, although it depends on the project, of course. But the benchmarking piece really needs more data out there to see, hey, what are the industry peers actually doing, right? And then therefore, for something so new as AI, you can't really compare it as well. But really glad to see. I mean, we have so many responses that are already saying that, evaluate user feedback, measure forecast accuracy, measure the ROI, which they seem obvious, but they're not that easy to actually put into practice. So really nice to see that.
Excellent. Thanks everybody for responding to that. Really appreciate it. And Alex and I are happy to connect with you on LinkedIn. You can see that in the chat box. And we have enough responses. We have well over 100 TISs, so we will share the full results. Alex, you already started talking about when is AI useful. And here's a series of icons as well as cubics as a way to keep it straight in our head.
Exactly. I tried to come up with some kind of acronym to make it easy to memorize. So basically, we've just seen why it makes sense to not just throw AI at everything and see what sticks. And before you proceed with any AI idea internally, it's therefore really good to run it through some kind of filter, right? What benefits will it unlock? What risks are there, and so on. If the answers aren't convincing, probably we shouldn't press ahead with it, right? We'll see some of those examples for forecasting specifically in a bit, but with this framework here that I tried to come up with, I'd like you to use this to really weigh where you'd like to use AI and where not, since the answers to each use case can differ greatly from company to company, right? So even the examples that I'll give you later might have my opinion in them versus your opinion might be somewhat different for your particular organization, right? Now, when it comes to cubics, the first C is really about control requirements, namely how much transparency and control is needed in the process, and which we're considering to add AI into. So, for example, a very typical use case for AI, such as generating predictive accounts receivable data, is something where I've seen organizations generally prefer having a very tight level of control and transparency, just to understand where those numbers are coming from. So a human is generally in the loop there. Generally, the trade-off is efficiency by using AI versus transparency, since AI can be a little bit of a black box. So when you have a use case that needs full transparency, maybe not the best AI use case. The U is about just potential use cases with, an S at the end, so multiple. And it's really about two things. On one hand, we want to make sure we have a very specific use case in mind already that provides a methodology on how to apply AI to the process. But on the other hand, it's also positive if you have a topic in hand that allows for various other alternative ways to explore AI as well. So you have something to pivot towards if it, doesn't work out quite as much as you thought it would. Naturally, the benefits for which the B stands for are super important. So if we implement a nice solution for a specific process, what's there to gain, right? Is it direct cost savings, time of your colleagues being freed up, more structured data? This point kind of goes back to the dangers of the AI pilots the MIT study talked about earlier. Since inherently we will be biased when evaluating a particular use case, it's actually okay if the benefits are really optimistic. And this is what the next three parts of the framework are kind of for to put it into perspective. The I in this case stands for the implementation efforts, and some pilots actually, on a positive note, can take surprisingly little effort to implement, such as chatbots, for example, that are being fed with some data and allow you to interact with them. In those cases, the barrier to entry is far lower, and it could really be beneficial to try it out, even if other aspects of the framework don't paint a super clear picture. Effort can, however, also be quite difficult to estimate during the use case, during the first few times of piloting a project. Unless, of course, you have an AI expert on board, and so this is a good one for assigning ownership to the right person and letting them perform this estimation first. Any project will also, of course, have certain risks and challenges associated with it, though. So this is what the next C stands for. If we take ARAP data normalization, for example, right? So at the very beginning of a forecast, we could probably think of an AI use case that involves extracting it and via natural language processing, making sure that it all gets normalized to the same format. It sounds somewhat fancy, but the risk is pretty high. If the wrong data or numbers gets extracted or hallucinated, like we mentioned earlier, well, the entire remainder of the forecasting process kind of goes down the drain, right? So you need to find out very, very carefully what risks there are with the specific process steps before moving on. And last but not least, of course, stakeholder buy-in and involvement is crucial. You need to validate very early whether everybody's on board, right? Your clients, your treasury ops, controllers, IT security, and so on. Because if that isn't the case, it's kind of bound to fail. And one suggestion I have here is that you can always shrink the use case a little bit and see if that might make it fit with the framework better and if that might need less stakeholders to implement it. And that way you can start small and then slowly build up on it as soon as you prove the value of it. So I think this should give us a good start for evaluating those AI use cases. And with that, I'd like to move on to actually looking at the forecast piece.
Right. And just before we do that, look at some of the challenges. Um, I'll leave this. You'll all have a copy of this, but what's changed over the last year? What's changed is there's more expectations, greater expectations that more challenges will be addressed using AI in treasury and finance. Cash forecasting went from 2/3 of people believing it could address those challenges to 3/4. We went from 5 out of 9 to just over 60% on risk management. And jumping over on the reconciliation side, just over a quarter in 2024 viewed it as being able to help on the reconciliation side, the manual reconciliation task, to just about a third. All these areas have increased. We haven't seen any decrease. That's the expectation of you and your peers. But that gets us to, if these are challenges, the biggest one is cash forecasting accuracy. How to go about building a forecast?
Exactly. So let's go back to the drawing board for a moment. When we talk about the forecast, what elements are even part of the process? And if we strip down all bells and whistles, what remains is basically what you see on the slide here, right? It starts with just getting the data sources, right? So where do you get your data from? Your bank statements, your ARAP from your ERP maybe, your FP&A sales forecasts, etc. Next step kind of is just designing that model, right? Do you have just a bunch of different rules where you categorize your cash flow categories? Do you have an AI model in this case, right? That kind of takes the inputs and makes sure to produce the certain transactions. All of those things need to go into that phase, and that might also be the biggest time effort there. The next one, of course, with transaction, I mean transaction generation. So how do we generate forecasted transactions? Again, is it a generative AI that generates it? Or is it some kind of growth factor that gets applied to historical data, for example? Is it just a regression or something like that, right? So multiple things that we can talk about here. On the adjustments piece, I'm sure you're intricately familiar with this, but regardless how automatic your forecast is, there'll always be certain, just macro situations or even micro situations in your particular company that will force you to kind of make certain adjustments to the forecast. And then afterwards, we go kind of into the more strategic piece of it, which is, hey, here you can actually do the reporting of it to your management, etc., and also analyze the results to kind of deduce different kinds of next steps from it. This is a little bit of a cycle naturally. When you analyze the results, you will probably want to make certain adjustments either to the specific forecast that you have or to the model design. Now, when it comes about evaluating which of these parts make a good use case for AI, again, there could be many different opinions here. I just want to give you a very quick overview on what I think, right? So when we look at the data sources, for example, the control requirements, that's something that I mentioned earlier already, right? Very high. Like you need to make sure that it's transparent what flows in. The use case potential is cool though, right? You can normalize your data. You don't need to care too much about where it comes from, etc. And the benefit that you get out of it is just much tighter coupling with most of your different systems, just because you can integrate them more easily. However, the implementation effort is relatively high. The risk level, again, is relatively high. And you need a lot of stakeholders from all of these different systems in your IT landscape in order to actually pull it off. So, with that being said, I'd say that is one of the less likely candidates for really good process optimization in your forecast using AI. With the model design, then it kind of depends what we're talking about, right? There's many different use cases you could imagine here, either just having an AI create the rules or just having a full-blown generative AI that will do the transactions. The benefits, of course, of using AI here could be just quicker onboarding, right? If you don't have to write 1,000 rules yourself, then it'll just move faster. The implementation effort, I'd say, it's not the highest implementation effort there is. And the challenge and the risk level as well is, we can argue about it. Let's put it that way, right? So this could be something where potentially you would want to continue, using AI or think about using AI. When it comes about all of these other pieces, then basically when you talk about transactions, this is something where, again, it gets complicated, right? You have lots of stakeholders that will want to see different transactions and will want to know where they come from. You have high transparency requirements. So despite this being one of the most talked about use cases for AI when it comes to forecasting, I am actually not so sure it is the best use case there, right? I think a far better use case would be the previous one that I mentioned, where it's like, hey, let's make sure that all of the different rules that actually predict or kind of are used to predict the transactions are created automatically, right? Adjustments, I'd say, are kind of in between the two, right? It's something where you have a lot less stakeholders that are interested in them. The level of implementation effort is still quite high, but the risk is lower than if your base forecast is just bad, right? And the potential benefit that you get out of it is just that you have unbiased automation, right? If a merger got delayed or something like that, and you move it yourself, you're always adding some bias, some human bias into it that you could remove here. And then reporting and result analyzing, I think those are two of the main benefits as well. You can very easily actually plug in, just some kind of LLM and make it report on the data that you give it. It gets you to extract the data and just have more operational efficiency, so you don't need to analyze Excel sheets or something like that. And it also doesn't really need that many stakeholders involved in it. Of course, the ones that read the reports are the ones that matter the most. Analyzing the results. Now, this one's a dangerous one because this could just mean getting some suggestions. It could also mean actually acting on those suggestions, right? Depending on how agentic we're talking about. Are we just talking about an LLM that gives you the suggestion? Or are we talking about an agent that actually performs the changes that are being suggested? So depending on these, you kind of have to plug in your own expectations here and see what would you like to use AI with the most. I hope that makes sense. Craig, do you have any comments about that before we move on? I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, no, I like the logic, the flow, and the organization of that. But we're gonna put the poll question up. Everybody can go ahead and answer that. It's an all that apply and hit submit. We won't talk about it, but we will share those with the whole group. But I will put the other slide up, and so yeah, we'll just step through the agent in action. Why don't you take this one too?
Yeah, of course. So this is basically the future that I want to talk about, right? We've talked about LLMs a lot, and these are what are being used mostly at the moment. In the future, maybe a couple months down the line, maybe for some it's a year, we will be putting all of that together, and you will want your whole IT landscape to kind of let loose AI agents on it, right? Kind of connect them together, make sure that things happen automatically. The reason I'm saying this is the future is because all of the various tools that you're currently using, they need to be ready for it, right? And that is currently just not quite yet the case. And typically, though, the flow would look something like what you see on the slide, right? You'd have an agent that's grabbing data from somewhere, so that could be, pulling the bank balances, ARAP, etc. That agent could then be checking for completeness, were there any spikes, when compared to history, for example. And afterwards, another agent or the same agent, depending on your setup, could check for anomalies, right? Missing entities because there was a stalling bank feed or something. This is where a human could then come in, right? Maybe you need to call the bank or something like that. Make sure that this gets rectified. And this is where we kind of have this feedback loop. But aside from the feedback loop, we kind of go further and then we could say, hey, all of the data we've now extracted, we're loading it into our cash flow forecasting model now, for example, right? Or other models that might be interesting for you. And once it's being loaded into the model and kind of has been forecasted upon, this is where we'll have another agent take the output of it and make sure to analyze the output, right? Make sure where the variance is coming from, what are the different averages that I have, etc. You can have a human coming in here at that point, or you could actually, connect it to another swarm of agents that might actually already do some of these changes for you, right? Move money around, right? Maybe initiate a payment or something like that. Now, I'd say from that part, we're still a little bit further away just because the trust in AI agents still need to be a little higher. But I definitely see that happening in the future. How about you,
Excellent. So
Craig?
this is an agent in action, and I'll take the next one on orchestrating agents, and you can lead us off on the final thoughts if that's okay, Alex. So
Sure.
this was a great example of a human getting involved in one agent. The next example is, one of the examples might be that agent was agent one. There's another agent. There's these smaller agents that do functions, and so you can have an orchestration agent that pulls these together or collaborates with them to perform a range of steps. And so like before you had the yellow items, human review, human in the loop activities with these different agents, there's a whole design and a flow of the agents, that one agent to coordinate the other agents to interact with multiple systems. I know that was really quick. Any key additional points on this one?
No, I think that's good. And it just brings me back to the point of actual integration, right? Like we can, for example, pull in or use agents via MCP if the integrated system has it, right? If they don't, then we can't do it yet, for example, right? So that's just an example from where I work. And so really what this tells us is that as more and more applications get familiar with AI, the better orchestration will be possible.
Yeah, excellent. And that brings us to final thoughts. And Alex,
Yeah.
Alex, by predetermination before the webinar, he's going to take the first two, and I'll take the last two.
Sounds good. Yeah. So I think really the key takeaway here is you need to be really selective on where you want to use AI, right? You don't want your efforts to fail. So focus them on where you have measurable impact and where the return on investment is the highest, right? Of course, this also means that you can get huge workflow relief, right? You can reduce all of your operational headaches and forecasting, for example, make it quicker to set up, streamline the manual processes that you have, and just really try to use AI for all of the menial work while you actually focus on strategy, right? On where you as a human add the most value.
Yeah, on the insight and oversight, the first point is that AI really helps improve accuracy, but you can design the AI activity so it operates in a black box, and you just see the output, and you just go, I hope I can rely on that. I don't know where it's coming from. And so how do we compensate for that? As we have explainability, we have documentation, having the AI agent show its work, show its logic so that it can be understood. Just like a macro, you're like, I don't know what that does. Larry built it, 4 years ago, and it seems to do everything, but we don't know how it works. There has to be explainabilities into the model so we can understand and trust them. And when there's changes, we know where to go. And then finally, this brick image of strategic foundations. We say take IT decisions with AI in mind to future-proof your organizations. Your IT group is looking at AI and looking at different models on how to do that. Make sure you're understanding what they're doing and work in alignment with that for what you're piloting, what you're testing, how you're moving forward. And the other piece that's important is if you're making decisions about technology platforms, it makes sense now to make sure that you're looking at platforms and vendors that support, and particularly natively support, AI integration, as opposed to saying, I'm going to build everything completely outside of my vendors. I know there's a lot of activity I can do inside and with other systems. And so there's the whole do it yourself, Home Depot, you buy all the materials, you build everything yourself, versus you have tools and vendors that support a lot of AI activity and integration natively within those. That's a key decision component. With that, I want to thank Alex and everyone for joining. There's questions about does TIS have these agents and other activities? I encourage you to talk with TIS. They have a platform for forecasting that uses and leverages these tools. Also, in the register for in the chat box, there's a register for the next TIS webinar. I encourage you to click on that and join us again soon. Thank you, Alex. We'll turn it back over to Brian.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Craig. And thank you, Alex. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. The CTP credits, today's webinar slides, and a recording of today's webinar will be sent to you within 5 business days. And as Craig mentioned, be sure to register for our next webinar with TIS on Treasury's vital role in ERP transformation projects by clicking the link in the chat box. Thank you, and we hope you have a good rest of the day.